Hello. I'd like to thank you, the Human Relief Organization, for having me here to talk to you guys today about some biological and health hazards. My name is Paul Hood. I'm currently one of the lieutenants here in the fire department. I'm also one of the infectious control officers, as well as the representative for the infectious disease um, committee that the local hospital has here. So some of the stuff we're going to talk about is just some of the basic um, biological and health hazards that we see today, as well as the U.S. has seen um, in its history. So when we talk about it, what is a biological hazard? A biological hazard is derived from a live pathogen or the byproduct of living things that cause or are related to the disease and death in plants, humans, and animals. So it has to meet all three of those. So what are some of the common biologics hazards that we see today? Typically, we will see bacteria, and that can be anything from strep to UTIs, urinary tract infections, salmonella, E. coli, Lyme disease, tuberculosis, gonorrhea, just name a few of the bacteria ones. We also see viruses, and some of those ones are, especially this time of year, you'll see is the common cold, the flu, measles, which we've just had, a recent outbreak of, hepatitis, yellow fever, HIV/AIDS, and the dengue fever. Some other common biological hazards you'll see are plant and animal irritants. That can be just from certain plants. Hyacinth bulbs, castor beans, rosemary pea, Daphne, and nightshade plants are particularly hazardous to humans. We see pollutants, so polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, HCBs, hexachlorobenzene, benzene, are just a few of the pollutants that we have in the air. Then we have our general toxins, which can be things from anthrax to botulism, pertussis, staphylococcal, ricin, and aberrin, just to name a few of the toxins that are out there. So some of the routes of transmission that we have is direct, indirect, and vector. Direct is pretty much skin-to-skin contact, can be mucous membranes. For women that are pregnant, could be the placenta barrier, breast milk. So a few things there to look at. Indirect is going to be foodborne, waterborne, or airborne. And then vector is pretty much a carrier of an infectious disease. One example of that could be like mosquitoes. Get a mosquito bite, and it pretty much does a transmission route of some disease processes that way. Number one way to prevent disease spread is hand washing. So washing your hands is easy. It's one of the most effective ways to prevent the spread of germs. Clean hands stop germs from spreading from one person to another and throughout an entire community, from your home and workplace to child care facilities and hospitals. 5 steps of hand washing, because it's important, is you wet your hands with clean running water, warm or cold, turn off the tap, apply the soap, and then you lather your hands by rubbing them together with the soap. Lather the back of your hands, between your fingers, underneath your nail beds. Scrub your hands for at least 20 seconds. If you need a timer, you can hum Happy Birthday song from beginning to end twice. You can rinse your hands well under the clean water as the next step, and then dry your hands using a clean towel or air dry them. You'll see this in some of the hospital settings will make you do this. I know when my daughter was born and she was in the special care nursery, every time we went in and out of the nursery, we actually had to wash our hands for 3 minutes. They actually had a timer on there, and if you finished before the timer went off, you had to wash your hands again. So obviously the hospital and the special care nursery, they take that very seriously, hand washing, to help prevent germs. So when should you wash your hands, right? We talk about the number one way to prevent germs. It should be done before, during, and after meal prepping, before eating, before and after caring for someone sick. That's why in EMS and fire service, we actually will wash our hands before and after patient care. After you go to the restroom, after blowing your nose, after touching an animal, then after touching garbage. Some of the big ones on when you want to wash your hands. And then some of the other ways that we can prevent the disease process is we have complex vaccinations, right? We've got vaccinations for the measles, pertussis, which is the whooping cough, flu, polio, tetanus, and meningococcal hepatitis B, and mumps. Other ways are considered medical treatments, which is rest, fluids, other forms of medications, like pain relievers, things like that, lab work, immunotherapy, and then just generally monitoring the patient depending upon what the toxin, the biological hazard is, depends upon how it affects the body. So sometimes you just have to generally monitor all the systems and then treat from there. Another way is protective clothing, right? You watch some of these movies, you watch the TV shows where people work in labs and they have their personal protective equipment, their PPE. So you always have to wear gloves, always have to wear goggles. Maybe they wear like Tyvek suits. Maybe when you get into some of the bigger, badder germs, you see them wearing respirators, you see them wearing like level A, level B chemical suits with their own, internal respiration. Then you see another one is environmental filtering of air and water, right? Usually those lab systems have a system in place that they can lock down that room and they'll take whatever the disease is. They can either blow it out of the room, depending upon what it is, or it isolates the room. And then water, you see every day we do fluoride treatment and whatnot to water. Next thing we're going to talk about is epidemics. So epidemics are illnesses caused by a single pathogenic sources that afflict a population at a rate that rises faster than the disease can be controlled, right? So it's something that's kind of gone out of whack, right? Like it's increasing, kind of like that snowball going down a hill. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. That's kind of what an epidemic is. An outbreak is considered a small number of people can constitute a case. So an outbreak is just a small area where a certain number of people kind of get sick, and then the epidemic is where it kind of evolves from that. Epidemics are defined by their geographical region. If it involves the entire globe or several countries, it can be called a pandemic at that point. So remember, an epidemic is smaller than a pandemic. So epidemic is considered to be described as a problem that's grown out of control, and the event is actively spreading. The pandemic relates to the geographical spread, as well as a whole country or the entire world is infected. So we've got some recent epidemics and pandemics in the area, well, not in the area, but across the globe. Obviously, HIV and AIDS pandemic, right? It's been going on since the 80s. It's considered to be a virus. It's considered, some countries actually consider it to be a treatable chronic disease in some of the developed countries. Some of these people that have HIV and AIDS, when they start getting the treatment, they actually live just as long as a person who's not treated, or as actually as long as everyday people, because they're getting the treatment. We have the H1N1 swine flu in 2009. That was also considered a virus. Of course, we've had the Ebola issues going on a couple times coming out of Africa. Initially was discovered in 1976, and the average case fatality rate is around 50%, and then case fatality rates have varied from 25 to 90% in some of the past outbreaks. So, and a lot of those numbers get skewed because of the underdeveloped countries that don't have the treatment or that just don't have the resources to deal with it. So that's why those numbers sometimes are a little bit skewed. Um, Another recent one is the SARS, which is a severe acute respiratory syndrome. It's a virus that came out in 2003. It was actually an outbreak and it's been contained. There have been no cases reported since 2004 of SARS. However, if you read some of the recent respiratory syndromes are kind of like a derivative of SARS, or includes a lot of the same ailments, the same complaints and stuff as SARS, but they're not actually SARS. And then we also have the H5N1, which is the aviation flu, also a virus, and it pretty much has been by direct contact and or droplets from dealing with birds. So if you're petting birds, if birds go to the bathroom on the ground and then they kick it up with their feet, that kind of pushes it into the air with the dust and droplets, and you can inhale that. So some of the top U.S. epidemics, which we'll go back to about the 1600s, is 1633 to 1634. We had the smallpox from the European settlers in the Boston area. And of that, 844 of the 5,800 Bostonians who had the smallpox died from it. In 1793, we had yellow fever from the Caribbean came. It actually hit the Philadelphia region. And of that, there was 5,000 deaths and over 17,000 had fled the city. And there was a vaccine was developed in 1953, and there's no known cure for the yellow fever. So just think back to Philadelphia, right? So you've got the 5,000 deaths. Then you've got 17,000 that fled the city. Now, are they infected people that fled the city? Were they not infected? And that's quite easily how diseases spread. You know, you're in an area where the disease is. You might not be infected. You're just a carrier for the disease. Then you leave, you go somewhere else, and you share a drink, or you eat the same meal and you use the same fork as somebody, then they get infected. You know, so back then you got to think about, you know, how good or how bad was their hygiene compared to what we have in today's world. Next one we have is you go back to 1832 to 1866. There's about 3 different waves of cholera that hit New York City. Cholera is considered an acute diarrheal infection caused by eating or drinking food or water that is contaminated with the bacterium Vibrio cholerae. So it's estimated at that time that about 2 out of every 6 Americans died during that outbreak in New York City. So once again, this is just simply by eating contaminated food and water, right? And once again, 1800. So how good was their hygiene? Probably. 1858, the U.S. was hit with scarlet fever. Also came in waves. Hit the New England region of the country. Once again, there's no vaccine for it. And once again, it's considered that improved hygiene is believed to have lessened the impact. So obviously they had made some changes, probably washed some hands a few more times, wash dishes, things like that. 1906 to 1907, we have Typhoid Mary outbreak in New York City. And of that's estimated about 10,771 people had died annually from that. And then 1918, the Spanish flu hit the United States. And it's estimated that that one took about 675,000 deaths. 1921 to 1925, we had the diphtheria epidemic that also was kind of across the United States as a whole. That one was about 15,520 people had died during the peak of that outbreak. And then we've got 1916 to 1955 is the peak of polio in the United States. That's considered to have peaked actually in 1952 were the highest numbers. And that was about 3,145 people died that year from the outbreak itself. 1981 to 1991, we have the second measles outbreak in the United States. Annual death rate was between 2,000 and 10,000 a year. If you followed any recent kind of events, we just kind of had a small recent measles outbreak here in the, well, adjacent to the Hampton Roads region is the Richmond area. And so the people came into Richmond Airport, and they had a couple measles, confirmed measles cases there. And, that's less than 30 minutes from our region. So those people could obviously travel into our region. If you have unvaccinated kids, that can spread the measles outbreak there. 1993, there was contaminated water in Milwaukee. It's considered that over 400,000 were infected, with nearly 100 deaths. So, that's 1993, and we're still having deaths from poor hygiene from water. 2010 to 2014 in California, they had the whooping cough. Of the 10,000 cases, 10 infants had actually died from that. And just think, they had cures for that, and they didn't have their kids vaccinated. Or people in the hospital didn't have the vaccinations and actually carried for the infants. Then, like we had talked about before, the 1980s brought the HIV and AIDS. It's believed to be about 1.2 million people are affected in the U.S. Because of it. So next, we're going to talk about once an outbreak occurs. So there has to be an investigation, right? So they have to gather information, confirm the existence of the outbreak. Well, how hard do you think that is when we've got people that are in possibly different states? Actually, let's break it down even further. So you've got different cities, different hospital systems, maybe in different counties, they don't talk to each other. Different states, we don't really talk to each other. Different countries, we don't talk to each other. So we can actually have this outbreak, and it can actually spread and spread and spread. And then it's not until it becomes a huge issue that we go, oh no, we have an outbreak. Let's deal with this now. Now you've got to try to track down all these source patients and where these people got infected or where they've been or where they traveled to. So you got to confirm the diagnosis. Then you got to establish a case definition, which is a standard set of criteria for identifying who has the disease. So a lot of these diseases are flu-like symptoms or general nausea, vomiting, diarrhea kind of stuff. And it's in the fall, right? People are going to think it's probably either maybe related to the cold or the flu. You might go to the hospital, they might just do their temperature, give them an IV, give them some fluids, give them an antibiotic, send them on their way and not think anything about it. And really, it could be the beginning of a biological outbreak. And then the patient obviously generally gets worse and worse and worse. So then they come back and then they figure that, something happened. Excuse me. They need to perform a descriptive study of what's going on. Develop and test an hypothesis on where the patients were, how they came in contact, what kind of similarities they have, how to treat it. Right. And that kind of goes with the implement control and prevention. If you can figure out where it all started, you can go back and kind of shut that down and then figure out where people have gone from there. And also you have to report your findings. Right. So we've kind of already talked about this, but you got to kind of work with public health departments, World Health Organizations, different countries, different emergency management systems. Maybe not everyone speaks English, so then you got to worry about translation, maybe some things get lost in translation. Then how do we, treat people in different countries once we find a cure for it or we find what treats those patients the best? Like we talked about, I think the hardest part is probably recognizing that an epidemic is occurring. The ability to locate victims and backtrack their actions. Existing and available medical treatment options for these patients. Do we just treat their symptoms that they have now, or is there some other medication that we can use to kind of help them get better. Right. Then there's consider the mechanism to control spread of the disease. Right. Is it airborne? Is it in the drinking system, the water system? I mean, you start talking about if we start using terrorists and talking about terrorism, you know, you can put stuff in food supply. You can put stuff in water supplies. Maybe do an airborne vector area where you just kind of spread it over an airborne area. You know, there's lots of different ways to do it, and it doesn't have to be, you know, outside terrorists. It could be in-home or ingrown terrorism just from inside the U.S. They have documented a case of that happening up in Oregon, where they went and put the biological agent on the salad bars and got people sick that way during an election year. So there's definitely the domestic terrorism that way. Right. So how do we control it? How do we do stop the spread of it? Obviously, public education. How do we educate the public? Right. So if you see someone who's, you know, nose is running, they have a fever, and there's, you know, general sickness, how do we tell if they have the common cold, the flu, or are they infected with some, you know, some terrible biological agent? So we got to do some education with that, with not only doctors, but the public, as well as EMS agencies. And obviously short-term, long-term disease prevention goals. So we got to decide how we're going to treat it in the short term, within the long term, how we're going to stop it from occurring again. Then there's also a couple of different insect and animal biological agents. Anything that kind of crosses over from animal to a human host is considered as a zoonotic agent or zoonotic disease. You see that a lot with like animals and a lot with like the insects, where they come and they actually, you get a mosquito bite, it transfers that way. You eat some food that's been, you know, like mad cow disease, you know, that kind of stuff. And then we talk about, there's also the colony collapse disorder, which is a situation where the honeybee population would suddenly disappear and resulted in the predictions of global food shortages of over 200 billion in food crops. I mean, we have countries that are starving now. You don't think that a drop of 200 billion in food crops wouldn't affect not only the US, but other countries. And then there are some plant epidemic causes. Usually it's caused by a change in the climate. That could be anything from rainfall, too much, too little, temperature, it's gone too hot or too dry, right? We talk about global warming. Change in sunlight, change in humidity, and wind, right? Some of the more recent plant epidemics in the history of the world is the Irish potato famine, right? Resulting in starvation of 1 million people and immigration of another 1.5 million. So if you are already short food, and then about 1.5 million people want to immigrate and come into your country, now, how are you going to take into account, you know, the food needed for those extra people? We've had the Bengal rice epidemic in 1942, and that was in Southeast Asia. That resulted in approximately about 2 million deaths. And then in our own country, in the United States, in the 1970s, we had the corn epidemic, which is thought to have resulted in about $1 billion in loss of revenue. So that one didn't actually result in fatalities, but that one pretty much resulted in loss of produce and, you know, loss of money that way. So I want to thank you guys for listening to my my presentation about some of the epidemic issues that we've had for both biological and health hazards in, you know, both the U.S. and as well as around the world. And I thank you very much.